The lawyer's office smelled like old paper and something heavier, the kind of silence that settles when people are waiting to take from you. I sat alone while my brothers, Femi and Kalad, took chairs together across the room. Mr. Adeyemi adjusted his glasses and began reading. When he reached the part about the house on Birchwood Lane, the house where Dad built bookshelves with his own hands and cooked jollof rice every Sunday, the room shifted. Femi leaned forward. Kalad crossed his arms. The number read aloud was larger than anyone expected. Dad had saved quietly, the way men of his generation did. He said nothing while alive and left everything in ink. Before the lawyer even finished the sentence, Femi stood and pointed at me. His voice was sharp and certain. She manipulated him, he said. She was the last one with him. She planted these numbers in a sick man's mind. The word thief came next. Not whispered. Spoken clearly, like a verdict already decided. Kalad nodded from behind him. I noticed the nods. I noticed everything. The room watched me, waiting for me to collapse or confess. I sat very still and did not cry, because crying in that moment would have looked exactly like guilt. By the time I got home, my phone had already been flooded. Cousins. Aunties. A family friend who had known me since I was 7. The messages were not asking questions. They were delivering conclusions. Someone had spoken to all of them before I had a chance to say a single word. Femi had been efficient. He always was. He was the eldest, the one people listened to first and questioned last. One message made my stomach drop. It was from Aunt Ngozi, Dad's older sister. She wrote, I did not raise your father for his property to end up with the greedy one. I put the phone face down and stood at the kitchen window for a long time. The street outside was completely ordinary. Children playing. A neighbor washing his car. The world continuing as if nothing dark had just happened in a quiet office on the other side of the city. That night, a cousin I trusted forwarded me a screenshot. It showed a group chat I was not part of. Femi and Kalad were making plans, not just to contest the will legally. Something bigger. Something that required organizing people, reaching specific contacts, and closing a circle around me before I understood what was happening. Whatever was coming had already started moving. I did not sleep. I sat at Dad's old writing desk and read the will again, not the copy the lawyer read aloud but my own. The one Dad quietly handed me 3 months before he died, on a Tuesday afternoon when the house was empty. He had folded it inside a brown envelope and said, read this alone. Keep it close. At the time I thought it was a standard duplicate. But sitting at that desk in the early hours, something stopped me. A clause was missing. Dad had specifically told me, during one of his hospital visits, that he included a protection clause, a condition preventing the property from being sold for 5 years, to give me time to settle. It was not in the document read at the lawyer's office. But I remembered his exact words and had written them in my journal that same evening, because something in his tone told me they mattered. I found the journal. I read my own handwriting. The clause existed. Which meant one of two things. It had been removed before the will was finalized, or someone had replaced the document entirely. My hands stopped trembling. Something colder replaced the fear. Someone had touched this will. I drove to Birchwood Lane the next morning. The house where Dad used to sit on the front step, watching the neighborhood settle into quiet. I still had a key. He had given it to me when he first got sick, in case he needed someone nearby quickly. When I turned into the street, I noticed the lockbox immediately. Bright silver. Brand new. Hanging exactly where the old handle used to be. I tried my key. It did not turn. I stood on that front step and understood with complete clarity what had happened. My brothers had changed the locks, not through legal authority, not through any court order. They had simply walked into a hardware store and installed new locks as if the house were already theirs. I walked around to the back. Same story. Through the kitchen window I could see boxes stacked near the dining table. Dad's bookshelf half emptied. Someone had been moving things quickly. The rush of anger that wanted to come, I held it back deliberately. Anger would not open that door. But inside that house were documents Dad kept in his bedroom cupboard. Files I had organized during his illness. If those records were still there before my brothers reached them, everything could change. I was still at the driveway when Mrs. Farida appeared from across the road. 71 years old, retired schoolteacher, the kind of neighbor who noticed everything and said nothing until the right moment arrived. She crossed over slowly, her eyes carrying something careful. "I was hoping you would come," she said quietly. She spoke right there on the pavement, voice low, eyes checking both ends of the street. The night Dad died, she had been unable to sleep. Around 2 in the morning she saw headlights, a car she recognized parked outside the house. She thought it was family arriving in grief. But then she saw them carry things out. Documents. A box with a green lid she had seen Dad carry inside many times. And a laptop bag. She had not said anything because she did not know who to trust. "Did you see their faces?" I asked. She nodded. It was Khalad. He was not alone. Another man moved with him, both working quietly and quickly, like people who had planned it in advance rather than people who were grieving. She offered to write down everything she witnessed. I told her I would likely need that. "Your father was a good man," she said softly, and crossed back to her side of the road. I was still in the car outside Mrs. Farida's house, writing down everything she had told me, when my phone buzzed. A bank alert, not from my personal account, but from the joint savings account Dad had kept for family emergencies. The one all 3 of us were still linked to, the one none of us had touched since before he died. The alert showed a withdrawal made that morning. I opened the banking app and checked the history. 3 withdrawals in the past 5 days. Each one modest enough to avoid triggering an automatic review. Each one just under the threshold requiring additional verification. This was not accidental. Someone understood exactly how the system worked. Withdrawing from a deceased person's estate account without probate clearance was not simply wrong. It was fraud. Khalad had been given access 3 years ago when Dad first fell ill, as a backup for urgent payments. He had been trusted. He repaid that trust with theft. I called the bank immediately and asked them to flag the account and block any further withdrawals pending legal review. The representative confirmed the request would be processed within the hour. Then I sat quietly. My brothers were not simply greedy. They were calculated. They had started moving money before the grief had even settled. I called Mr. Adeyemi the next afternoon and asked to meet privately. He agreed, though his voice carried a carefulness that had not been there before. We sat in his office with the door closed. No assistant. No extra chairs. He folded his hands on the desk like a man preparing for a confession he had not finished writing. I asked him directly about the protection clause, whether it had ever been part of the original document. He was quiet for longer than a simple answer required. Then he said the will had gone through 2 revisions in the final weeks before Dad passed. During that period he had received multiple visits from Femi, framed as clarifications to keep the language simple. He used the word simplify twice. I heard it both times. "Were you pressured?" I asked. He looked at the desk. I was encouraged to make certain sections more concise. My voice stayed level. "A clause my father personally described to me is missing. If it was removed under pressure, that is not concision. That is tampering." He said nothing immediately, but his hands unfolded slowly. In that small movement, I understood. He was not my enemy. He was a man who had made a mistake under pressure and was now sitting directly across from its consequence. I drove home slowly that evening, taking the long route through the old neighborhood where we grew up before Birchwood Lane. Past the primary school. Past the church where Dad was still remembered by name. I was trying to understand, not in legal terms but in human ones, how we had arrived at this moment. Because this conflict had not started at the reading of a will. It had been building for years. Femi had always been reckless with money from an early age. He started businesses that failed and expected the family to absorb the losses quietly. Khalad was different, quieter, more careful, but he followed Femi the way a shadow follows movement. He never led, but never pushed back either. I was the one who stayed close to Dad in his later years. Who drove him to appointments. Who sat beside him when doctors explained things in language Dad pretended to understand, then asked me to translate later at home. I had done those things because he was my father and I loved him. Not to earn anything. But my brothers had been watching that closeness. They had decided that what looked like love was actually strategy. They were completely wrong. But they had already convinced enough people otherwise to matter. 3 days after meeting Mr. Adeyemi, I went back to the earliest memory of Dad discussing his plans. It was a Sunday, 8 months before his diagnosis. He called me into the study and asked me to help draft a personal letter. Not a legal document, but something addressed to all 3 of us in his own words, explaining every decision he had made. I typed as he spoke, his voice slower than usual, choosing each sentence deliberately. When we finished, he printed it, signed it, and placed it inside a brown envelope marked simply Children. He said he would keep it in the cupboard beside his bed. I had seen it there myself during later visits. After Mrs. Farida described Khalad removing documents the night Dad died, I went completely cold. The letter. Khalad had taken the letter. The one document containing Dad's actual voice and reasoning, the one thing that could not be argued with or revised by any lawyer on earth. Without it, I had evidence of tampering but no clear explanation of intent. With it, the full picture became completely undeniable. I needed to find it before my brothers realized exactly what they were holding. The gathering was called a family meeting, just an informal discussion, Aunt Ngozi said. I went because Dad always said walking away from the table was the same as giving up your seat. The sitting room was full when I arrived. Extended family. 2 of Dad's old friends. A pastor from the church on Jubilee Road. All already seated, all clearly spoken to before I walked in. I understood that within the first 30 seconds. Femi spoke first, practiced, smooth, the kind of smooth that comes from rehearsing. He talked about family values and protecting Dad's legacy. He used the phrase undue influence 3 times. Then Khalad spoke, softer, sadder, more convincing to people who did not know him well. One of Dad's friends shook his head slowly while Khalad talked, the way people do when something feels confirmed. Then they turned to me. I looked around at faces I had known my entire life, now wearing expressions of disappointment and distance, and felt the full weight of what had been done. They had not waited for evidence. They had accepted the story told first and told loudest. My mouth opened. Then I closed it. Explaining myself to people who had already decided was not fighting. It was begging. And I was done. I left Aunt Ngozi's house quietly. No argument. No scene. A polite goodbye that confused people more than anger would have. On the drive home, something settled inside me. Not peace. Direction. The kind of clarity that comes when you stop waiting for someone to understand and start deciding what to do instead. That night at Dad's desk, I made a careful list, not of grievances, but of facts. Every withdrawal from the estate account, with dates from the bank alerts. Mrs. Farida's name and what she witnessed. Mr. Adeyemi's exact words, simplify and encouraged, and the date we met. Every visit to Dad during his illness, with dates pulled from my calendar and old messages. Every phone call logged. Every errand captured in photos I took simply because I photographed everything. My phone was a quiet diary of the last 2 years of my father's life. His appointments. His meals. His improvements and sudden declines. Scattered through all of it were moments proving something my brothers had never considered. I had not been positioning myself. I had simply been present. Evidence of love looked almost identical to evidence of dedication. And dedication, properly documented, was something a court could read. I needed a lawyer who owed my brothers absolutely nothing. I found the financial records by following a single thread. I contacted Dad's accountant, Mr. Babajid, asking whether he had copies of Dad's tax filings. What he sent back was far more than expected. He had kept records going back 11 years, carefully maintained because Dad had specifically asked him to. And Dad had been quietly worried about Femi for a very long time. The records showed a pattern I had not fully understood while it was happening. Over a decade, Dad had made regular transfers to Femi, not gifts but bailouts. Business debts settled before creditors could escalate. A personal loan taken against Dad's property that he quietly repaid. A supplier dispute handled privately to protect Femi's reputation. The amounts were significant. Khalad had his own separate column. Smaller amounts, more consistent, a quiet monthly arrangement never discussed at any family table. Dad had been carrying both of them in silence, paying off their failures while carefully building something he intended to leave behind. The missing protection clause suddenly made sense. He had not excluded them to punish anyone. He had structured things carefully because he understood what they were capable of when unchecked. And they had dismantled that protection before the ink had properly settled. Khalad called me on a Thursday evening. I almost did not answer. But instinct told me to pick up and say very little. He opened with the tone he used when wanting something. Softer than Femi, patient, willing to circle the point slowly. He talked about the family. About how things had gotten out of hand. He painted himself as the reasonable one caught in the middle. I made small sounds of acknowledgement and kept my voice completely flat. Then he slipped. He described what he called the original arrangement. A plan formed before the lawyer's reading. He mentioned a specific meeting. He said certain things had been handled beforehand to make things cleaner. He used the phrase, cleaned up the paperwork in a voice that expected me not to understand its meaning. I understood exactly what it meant. I was recording the call. I had started recording the moment I recognized his voice, because I had decided the night at Dad's desk to document everything going forward, no exceptions. When we hung up, I sat still for several minutes. Then I played the recording back. His voice came through clearly. Every word. Every slip. I saved it in 3 separate places. Then I called Barrister Omitund and told her what I had. Barrister Omitund was 60 years old, sharp-eyed, and had spent 30 years in estate litigation. She was not impressed easily or frightened easily. When I laid everything on her desk, the recording, the bank alerts, Mrs. Farida's written account, my journal, Mr. Babajid's financial records, she read through each item slowly, with attention that made me feel, for the first time since the lawyer's office, that someone was genuinely seeing the full picture. She made notes. She asked 2 precise questions. Then she said, the recording alone is not sufficient. The neighbor's statement is solid. But the strongest element is the accountant. She tapped Mr. Babajid's records. These show a decade of dependency your brothers will struggle to explain in any probate context. They were not heirs treated equally. They were liabilities quietly managed. She paused. Your father knew that. He structured accordingly. Which means what was filed at that office was not his real intention. It was a version of it. She outlined what would come next, a formal objection to probate, a request to freeze the estate account, a subpoena for original will drafts. I listened carefully. The truth was larger than I had yet understood. Barrister Omitund found the answer inside Mr. Babajid's final sealed file. A document Dad had asked him to hold separately, labeled with a date 3 weeks before he died. Inside were 2 handwritten pages in Dad's own script, slightly shaky from illness but completely clear in meaning. He had written his reasons. Not for a court. For himself. He had structured the will the way he did because he had watched what money had done to Femi and Khalad, funding recklessness, debt, and the consistent avoidance of responsibility. Leaving everything equally divided would not honor anyone. It would fund more damage. The largest portion was directed to me because I had demonstrated I could hold something and build with it rather than spend and return asking for more. He said he was not choosing me because I was the best child. He was choosing the path most likely to preserve what he had spent his life building. He trusted me not because I was his favorite but because I had shown him, over many quiet years, that I understood the difference between having something and truly caring for it. He had known they might challenge this, and had written that if they did, the full financial history would explain exactly why. There was a second document. Barrister Omitund called 3 days after filing the formal application to freeze the estate, her voice carrying something close to satisfaction. Mr. Babajid had found it going through the final folder more carefully. A separate legal filing, not through Mr. Adeyemi, but through a different notary in another part of the city, 2 months before Dad died. During that period Dad had been well enough to travel a short distance alone. He told me once he had an errand. I offered to drive him. He said he would manage. I assumed it was medical. It was not. Dad had filed what is called a precautionary declaration, a legal document setting out his full wishes and reasoning, signed, witnessed, and lodged with the court registry independently of his main will. A backup. A quiet one. The kind that only becomes relevant when a main will is challenged or tampered with. He had known this moment might come. He had known my brothers well enough to prepare a second layer of protection in silence, because silence was his way of building a wall no one would know to knock down. We had it now. And it changed everything. Getting back into the house was not something I did carelessly. I thought about it for 2 full days. I asked Mrs. Farida to stand at the driveway end and call me immediately if any unfamiliar car appeared. She agreed without a single question. I went in through the bathroom window at the back. Dad had always kept its latch loose, in case any of us forgot our keys as teenagers, and he had never fixed it. My brothers changed the front locks. They had not thought about the bathroom window. Inside, the house smelled different. Emptier. Boxes had multiplied in the dining room. Some furniture had been moved. Dad's hand-built bookshelf was completely stripped. I did not stop to look. I went straight to the bedroom cupboard, bottom drawer. Inside were files I had organized during Dad's illness. Medical records mostly. But underneath them, still untouched because my brothers had not looked deep enough, was a plastic sleeve. Bank correspondence. An insurance policy. And at the bottom, in Dad's handwriting, the name and address of the notary where the precautionary declaration had been filed, with a reference number. I photographed everything carefully, left it exactly as found, and went back out through the bathroom window. Barrister Omitund spread the documents across her table at our next meeting, arranging them the way a person arranges pieces of a picture they are finally seeing whole. The precautionary declaration was clear. Dad's intent was clear. Mr. Babajid's financial records were clear. The recording of Khalad's phone call was clear. Mrs. Farida's written account of that night was clear. Together, they told a story in which my brothers had not simply contested a will they disagreed with. They had removed documents from the home of a deceased person the night he died. They had made unauthorized withdrawals from an estate account before probate was completed. They had pressured a lawyer to alter legal language. They had run a campaign to discredit me with family before the process had even begun. Each item alone was arguable. Together they formed a pattern very difficult to explain in any innocent direction. They will say they were protecting the estate, Barrister Omitund said calmly. They will say the withdrawals were for expenses. They will say the recording is out of context. She looked at me steadily. But they will say all of that in a room where I control what gets presented first. In legal proceedings, the order of evidence matters enormously. She paused. What I need now is the right moment. I did not contact Femi or Khalad after Barrister Omitund told me we were ready. I let 4 days pass. I went to work. I cooked dinner. I called a friend I had been avoiding and talked about ordinary things. I gave no sign anything had changed. On the 5th day, Femi called. He was confident the way people are when they believe no one around them is watching carefully. He said the estate review was progressing, things were being finalized, and it would be better for me to reach a private understanding before everything became unnecessarily public. He used the word embarrassing while discussing our father's will. I let him finish. Then I agreed calmly that it was important to resolve things properly. I suggested a meeting at Mr. Adeyemi's office, all relevant parties present, including a probate court representative and a guest I described only as someone with an interest in the accuracy of the process. He agreed immediately. That confidence again. He believed he was walking into a conversation he had already won. I hung up and called Barrister Omitund. Then Mr. Babajid. Then the probate court to confirm the date. My brothers believed they were tightening a net around me. What they had actually done was walk directly into the center of mine. The meeting was on a Wednesday morning. Mr. Adeyemi's office felt smaller with everyone in it. Femi arrived with a confidence that filled the room. Khalad came in behind him, quieter, scanning the space, and stopping when his eyes landed on Barrister Omitund beside me. He had not expected someone of her reputation. I saw it in the tightening around his jaw. A probate court representative sat near the window. Mr. Babajid sat to my left with printed records. Mrs. Farida had submitted her statement in writing, present without physically being there. Barrister Omitund did not begin with accusations. She began with documents. Calmly. One page at a time. The estate account records. The bank's confirmation of the withdrawals. Mrs. Farida's timeline. Then the financial history, 11 years of transfers showing the full pattern of dependency. Femi tried to speak. Barrister Omitund raised one hand. He stopped. She placed the precautionary declaration on the table last. Dad's own separate filing, his own words, his own signature, independently registered. The room went very quiet. Then she turned to me and gave a small, deliberate nod. I opened my phone, pressed play, and set it on the table. Khalad's voice filled every corner of that office. Every word. Every slip. Every confession. The recording ended and the room stayed still. Then Femi spoke in a voice I had never heard from him before. The practiced smoothness was entirely gone. Where did you get that? What remained was smaller and less prepared than anything I had witnessed from him. Barrister Omitund answered, explaining calmly that the recording had been made legally during a call Khalad himself initiated. Khalad stared at the table, hands flat on the surface, like a man trying to feel something solid beneath him. The probate court representative asked Mr. Adeyemi directly about the revision meetings. He spoke carefully but honestly. He confirmed the meetings. He confirmed the pressure applied. He did not use the word tamper, but placed beside everything else on that table, his words carried exactly the same meaning. Femi tried once more, talking about family, about keeping things private, about what Dad would have wanted. I let him finish. Then I said clearly and quietly, Dad prepared for this. He anticipated what you would do and put something in place to stop it. Femi had nothing to follow that with. The room turned in that moment. The same way it had once turned against me. But now completely the other direction. Within 72 hours, the situation had moved from a family dispute into the hands of the appropriate authorities. The fraud unit received the full estate account records. The Law Society received a formal complaint about the pressure placed on Mr. Adeyemi. The probate court suspended all further processing of the estate pending complete independent review. Femi tried reaching me through Aunt Ngozi. She called twice. The second call I answered briefly. She said Femi wanted to talk. I told her calmly that all communication would now go through Barrister Omitund and that I wished her well. She was quiet. Then she said something unexpected. She said she was sorry, not for them but for herself. For accepting the first story without asking to hear mine. I thanked her and ended the call. Khalad sent a long message directly to my phone, full of words like family and forgiveness, and Dad would not have wanted this. I read every word carefully. Then I handed the phone to Barrister Omitund and asked what she recommended. Her advice was simple. Say nothing for now. Let the process move. What mattered was that the formal review was in motion and my brothers were no longer controlling the pace, the direction, or the story of anything connected to this estate. Within 72 hours, the situation had moved from a family dispute into the hands of the appropriate authorities. The fraud unit received the full estate account records. The Law Society received a formal complaint about the pressure placed on Mr. Adeyemi. The probate court suspended all further processing of the estate pending complete independent review. Femi tried reaching me through Aunt Ngozi. She called twice. The second call I answered briefly. She said Femi wanted to talk. I told her calmly that all communication would now go through Barrister Omitund and that I wished her well. She was quiet. Then she said something unexpected. She said she was sorry, not for them but for herself. For accepting the first story without asking to hear mine. I thanked her and ended the call. Khalad sent a long message directly to my phone, full of words like family and forgiveness, and Dad would not have wanted this. I read every word carefully. Then I handed the phone to Barrister Omitund and asked what she recommended. Her advice was simple. Say nothing for now. Let the process move. What mattered was that the formal review was in motion and my brothers were no longer controlling the pace, the direction, or the story of anything connected to this estate. What I wanted was what Dad had actually intended. Not simply the house on Birchwood Lane or numbers in an account, but something real. A foundation. Barrister Omitund filed the final documents on a Tuesday. The precautionary declaration was accepted as fully valid by the probate court. The estate was redistributed in accordance with Dad's actual recorded wishes, not the altered version. The protection clause was reinstated. The 5-year restriction on the property's sale stood exactly as Dad had written it. The financial history was formally entered into the court record, meaning every future legal question about the estate would carry that context permanently. Femi and Khalad's legal costs were assigned to them personally, not drawn from the estate. The fraud case involving the unauthorized withdrawals was referred separately to run its own course. On the day the court issued its final order, I was not in the room. Barrister Omitund called me afterward, her voice carrying a warmth that did not often surface in her professional tone. "It is done," she said simply. I sat in my car for a long moment. Outside the window the city moved at its usual pace. Something I had been holding tightly for months slowly loosened inside me. Not everything, but enough. 5 months have passed since the lawyer's office where my brothers called me a thief and a full room believed them. The house on Birchwood Lane is no longer locked against me. I have a new key that turns without resistance. I let myself in on a Saturday and stood in the hallway without moving. The smell was still there. Old paper and cooked rice and the faint cedar of Dad's furniture. I sat in his chair. The one where he used to read and argue with the television. I brought his personal letter, recovered from a box Khalad stored at a relative's house. That relative, after learning the truth, returned it without being asked. I read it in Dad's chair in his house, in the quiet of an afternoon. He had known me. He had seen me clearly, without noise or comparison. He trusted me not because I was loudest, but because I had been present in ways requiring no announcement. My brothers face their consequences now. That chapter belongs to the courts. What belongs to me is this house, this chair, this letter, this name. They tried to take all of it. They failed. Not because I was stronger. Because I was more patient. And because truth, once properly spoken, needs no permission to stand.